You have one of the landmark buildings down in the financial district, 40 Wall Street. Did you have any damage, or did you know what's happened down there?
Well, it was an amazing phone call I made. 40 Wall Street actually was the second tallest building in downtown Manhattan, and it was actually, before the World Trade Center, was the tallest. And then when they built the World Trade Center, it became known as the second tallest, and now it's the tallest.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We are broadcasting from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic, roaming the digitosphere in the ever-aggressive, ever-growing, ever-expanding TMBS universe. On this anniversary of the 2 September 11th, the terrorist attack of September 11th, 2001, the coup in Chile in 1973, the CIA-backed coup that brought Augusto Pinochet to power and overturned the democratic will of the Chilean people. We are talking about a major victory for Indigenous rights activists in Canada. Doug Lain, publisher of Zero Books, a book publisher that I am currently under contract writing a book for, also host of the Zero Books podcast. We're talking about September 11th, the invasion of Iraq, the economic meltdown, and the concepts from Marx that will help you own any capitalist you should come across. Plus, of course, we have a Griscom economic minute. Speaking of owning capitalists, Matt Leck with a media regulate, and a letter from Lula to the Brazilian people as the struggle against that country's oligarchy and judicial coup continues. Plus a post game for patrons. We're breaking down Nike Kaepernick ad, culture, politics, brands, social movement, co-optation, and opportunity. Donald Trump brags about Puerto Rico, but it's the type of travesty that would take down any other presidency. Plus, Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism. We revisit it, break it down, let you know what's really going on. Dave Rubin gets aspirational about his Coke funding. And of course, Joe Rogan, Elon Musk. And it was so good we might have to do it again, but Cider versus the crazy professor. Become a patron and call Discord and IM. Get it all. Hang with the crew in the TMBS postgame. All that and more. This is the Michael Brooks Show. Let's get it. It is the anniversary of September 11th. And we know that the atrocities of that day, which killed thousands of people in lower Manhattan and people in Washington, D.C., and took down a plane in rural Pennsylvania, was a really, truly horrific event in American and global history. It also set off a wave of essentially a global crime spree of torture, preemptive invasions, civilian casualties by the Bush administration. And it also set off the drone program, which began under Bush but significantly increased under the presidency of Barack Obama. This Sunday, for patrons, Derek Davison and I are doing an illicit history of the war on terrorism. And one of the things that always comes out is that the Obama administration's efforts to outsource the war on terror, so-called, even though they, to their credit, stopped using that term, to drone and special forces units were both an incredible danger to the democratic process and something that caused a significant amount of civilian misery across the globe, particularly in Pakistan and Yemen. Obama expanded drone strikes over the Bush administration. Obama authorized nearly 540 drone strikes in his presidency, and he institutionalized the use of drone strikes as a core building block of U.S. foreign policy. They claimed that there were only between 64 and 116 civilians killed in drone strikes as of 2015, whereas more serious and very low estimates would put the sort of the actual number at well over 1,000. The Obama administration also instituted something called the signature strike. A signature strike was a drone strike that was built on behavioral patterning. So basically, if they mapped out a group of, say, young men in Pakistan, in a particular tribal area, they would say, well, this fits a behavioral model of what a terrorist might look like, so we'll authorize a strike on it. We don't know who is there. We don't actually know who we're hitting. We just know in the sort of technocratic delusion of the policy that we think we're hitting the right target. So therefore, by definition, with signature strikes, you could even measure civilian casualties. This had a relentless effect on the ground and also warped the perspective of U.S. policymakers, something that even General Stanley McChrystal actually articulated an understanding of. Here he is from a speech at Stanford Business School a couple of years ago, talking about the psychology of drone strikes for both the victims and recipients and those who order them in the United States.
I think drones are here to stay. We're going to use them. We need to use them, and they're an important part of what we do. And we're actually going to use them even more. So I think that's important. But they are different. They're different because they are perceived differently. Now, if you think about it, there are several factors. The first is, go back to 1988. Anybody remember what happened in 1988? How many of you weren't born in 1988? That's very sad. President Clinton ordered Tomahawk missile strikes into Afghanistan and to Sudan in response to pretty clear activities on the part of Osama bin Laden.
Pause it.
Now,
of course, I just have to do a fact check here because President Clinton's the strikes in Sudan ended up being on a pharmaceutical factory and were not having to do with activities of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and in fact cost a huge humanitarian toll in the Sudan. That always needs to be noted. Go ahead.
Now, if those Tomahawk missiles didn't kill UBL, but they killed various people, created damage, if you'd asked the average American the next morning if we were at war, what would we have said? No, we're not at war. We fired some Tomahawk missiles. If you were near the impact point of a Tomahawk missile and you asked the next morning if they were at war with America, what do you think they'd say? The answer is probably different. So if it lowers the threshold on the use of military force, it's dangerous. And what I mean, if it can be too casual, it can seem too easy, too inexpensive, too risk-free, and it increases your likelihood of doing it, then I would say everyone who orders one ought to go stand next to where one has gone off and where you see body parts and things like that. It's very different. So I'm not saying we don't use them. I'm saying you got to make sure you understand what you're doing. The other part of it is perceptions. We've got problems with some Mexican drug lords in the U.S. and whatnot, and the Mexicans are after them. But what if Mexico flew across the border with drones and did a missile strike in Texas? How would we respond? Probably not well. And it's the perception of we can step back and hurl thunderbolts like Thor without any risk to ourselves that's viewed as arrogance. Now, whether that's right or wrong, perceptions matter in the world. That's why people go to war, because they perceive something. So I think we've got to be very, very thoughtful about how everything we do is actually perceived by others. Again, not throw out the capacity entirely, but be really thoughtful about it.
So there's this sort of strategic calculus, and there's a lot I disagree with in terms of the sort of base assumptions there, but nonetheless, that is actually a smart assessment of how these weapons work on the ground and the absolute skew in perceptions from the United States. Don't forget that the appeal, and one of the reasons that the Obama administration relied on drones so much is, let's be real, the American public was not paying attention to them. There was barely any reporting on civilian casualties and deaths in Yemen or Pakistan, the expansion of the drone war to Somalia under President Obama until well into the Obama administration, let alone the fact that it was handled in dual tracks between the Pentagon and the intelligence services. Malala Yousafzai actually did get shot and almost murdered as a result of her advocacy for rights in Pakistan and her opposition to terrorist groups like the Taliban. Here she is talking much more simply and plainly about what drone strikes have done in terms of terrorist recruitment in Pakistan.
Terrorists are killed because of drone attacks, but terrorism is increased and terrorism spread more and more. So if the drone attacks continue, terrorism will spread and more people will become terrorists, because if a child's father is killed, that child can become a terrorist. So we need to find other solutions against terrorism.
Of course, after President Obama's administration came to an end, and if you ever argued with liberals who had no serious analysis of the massive surveillance programs of the Obama administration, an ungoverned global drone program, all of that, if you finally push came to shove, you'd say, well, what if the next person who becomes president is not like Barack Obama? What if they're an absolute lunatic? And names like Ted Cruz came to mind. Very few of us anticipated just what level of absolute lunatic was coming into the presidency. And this lunatic, Donald J. Trump, who has thrown the keys to a massively expanded drone program in national security state, has, of course, upped the tempo and massively increased drone attacks in further countries in Africa. He's authorized a total of 161 strikes alone in 2017. And there were 615 U.S. airstrikes in 2016, 1,248 in 2017, and 353 between January and May 2008. That's not just drone strikes, that's airstrikes, period. The United States dropped and fired 1,333 bombs and missiles in 2013, 4,361 in 2017, 2,339 in the first 5 months of 2018. And civilian casualties have increased significantly across the board, of course, from a candidate who promised to bomb the shit out of people and has absolutely no regard for human life. So this is what happens when imperialism is unchecked, and when imperialism attempts to be rationalized and codified. It doesn't work in and of itself, and then it gets into the hands of a guy whose first reaction to looking at the towers, at least the first reactions that we have him on tape, is to go, oh, wow, my building's a lot. I think it's number one now. So there you have it. Guys, thoughts on drones?
It's been quite a worrying development to watch, even under Obama, the use of drone strikes. And as you were saying, Trump inheriting this apparatus is absolutely frightening. Not only did he inherit it, but he's really just shredded up every kind of rules and regulations that were implemented in the Obama administration, which, given the horrific statistics that we were reading earlier, weren't very good in the first place. Now imagine not having any kind of pushback institutionally against like the indiscriminate use of drone strikes. And we've also seen in the past 6 months that the U.S. has really been expanding our ability to use drones across Africa, including even operating drones from Greece, right, which is a new development, and also have been building more capacity in other African countries. So, it's definitely something that's very frightening, and something that we need to be sure that we continue to push on, because every day the news cycle is so wild with Trump and all these other things that are going on. And this was something that was going on under Obama, and a lot of people were missing it then. And it's really important in these kind of like exceptional times that we don't forget about what's going on in our name.
It's exceptional. It's no doubt it's exceptional.
I want to bring up one of my favorite historians, Brian Kilmeade, who he has this...
Oh, right. He's a noted scholar of the Tripoli pirates, of course.
The funny thing about Kilmeade's books is it always sort of... You can see what it's sort of rationalizing, as for empire. I mean, right. I don't think Kilmeade's conscious of any of this.
I don't think he's conscious of it. But potentially his ghostwriters are.
But like Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli pirates, basically my understanding of this, and I'm not really familiar with the history, but Jefferson said, hey, some pirates are harassing our merchants. Let's go like bomb them with our ships, right?
He said we got to bomb the shit out of them. What would be a good... Actually, Jefferson probably had like a southern cracker accent, right?
I think you should do Jefferson surgical strikes, actually.
I was like, if you look at the relationship between me and Sally Heming.
But it's like, this is the sort of thing we do to...
This is a thing we can be really precise about. We're not killing every single pirate.
They're just pirates.
They're just pirates.
Why are they in the ocean?
Now, do we need to govern dealing with pirates? Yes, there needs to be an institutional basis.
And it just seems as sort of thinly veiled, rationalizations for, the Tripoli Pirates is a nice code word for Muslims.
Oh, definitely.
And I don't know.
The Tripoli Pirates, some bad guys.
Some bad dudes.
Tough guys. Bad dudes. Bad hombres. All right, guys, let's get to the shout out. And by the way, we're putting out solicitations for a 1970s PBS public interest style, like really extremely stuffy music for the Griscom Economic Minute.
Think Ron Burgundy's dad.
Ron Burgundy's dad on public television without any bachelor pad flair. Think Tim Robbins in the Ron Burgundy movie, actually. You remember Tim Robbins? When they all have the big local TV anchor street fight, and Tim Robbins is from PBS. Oh. He's like,
I forgot his part in that.
He's like, no advertising, no mercy, and he throws his pipe down and brings out like a shank. That's the type of thing we need for Griscom.
I bet that movie holds up well.
That movie's funny. All right, now without further ado, the great DJ Danarchy to bring us into the shout-out session.
Shout out. Creepy. Shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out.
That's incredible.
This is crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. That's creepy. Shout out. That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is
Out of control.
This is weird. Shout out.
Thanks, guys. That's not what we're talking about.
The fucking Don Jr. button. As always, welcome Alex Jones, people. If you can't find your guy anywhere, we'll give you a little dose.
We're continuing the info war right here.
Yeah, the info war continues right here at TMBS Studios. I also, it's weird. I almost, maybe because I do the Obama so much, the beginning of that Alex Jones sounds almost a little Obama-ish to me. It's like, that's weird.
They have a lot more in common than you'd think.
I think Alex Jones and Barack Obama are both self-made guys. They're both great performers. They both have their different pulses, but they both have their finger on different pulses of America. They're both very different parts of the zeitgeist. Anyways, I think we could actually make that case. Today's shout out goes to Indigenous activists in Canada who've actually just scored a really significant victory over the energy giant Kinder Morgan. Just for a little bit of context, this is a pipeline project that was rushed through by the Trudeau government. The Trudeau administration continues to be the global exemplar of the pseudo-woke, but Canada, both through its sort of grassroots left organizing through Indigenous political networks there, and also a lot of mass solidarity work with all sectors, including, of course, also the ecological movement, have just scored a big victory. And we're going to just play a brief clip now of Juan Gonzalez on Democracy Now! Breaking down this court ruling. This is a big victory for activists in Canada.
Well, in a major victory for Indigenous groups and environmentalists, Canada's Federal Court of Appeals has rejected the government's approval to triple the capacity of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. On Thursday, Justice Eleanor Dawson nullified licensing for the $7.4 billion project and brought construction to a halt until the National Energy Board and the federal government complete court-ordered fixes. Her ruling cited inadequate consultations with Indigenous peoples affected by the project and found the National Energy Board's assessment of the expansion was so flawed that the federal cabinet should not have relied on it during the approval process.
They went on just minutes, and I'm quoting now from Democracy Now!, just minutes after the court's decision, Kinder Morgan shareholders agreed to sell the existing pipeline and expansion project to the federal government for $4.5 billion. Prime Minister Trudeau had announced in May that Canada would purchase the pipeline. This means that the government now owns the project as its expansion faces years of further review. So, obviously, activism continues with regards to that project, reining it in and dealing with it. But now, the stakes are actually very clear in a different way, which is, I mean, it's even one thing for a Canadian government under Justin Trudeau that has consistently sold out the interests of the environment and Indigenous peoples, has continued to push forward being a massive energy and oil exporter and arms seller, in complete contradiction of its sort of touchy-feely image. But now literally owning the project themselves, I think, will be as clear as it could get in terms of their fundamental commitments. And it's also an incredible success for grassroots activism and the Indigenous rights community in Canada. And it's a story we will continue to follow very closely. You guys have any thoughts on this as well? I know that we're actually planning some additional illicit history content that has to do with Native people's history in Northern America as well.
I don't have much to add except it's super inspiring, and I think going to be central to the future of these sorts of protests is what Indigenous people have done, especially in Dakota Access Pipeline and like other places. It's I think we should cover a lot more of that.
AOC helped. AOC, one of her core building blocks of her modern political career is activism with regards to Doppel protests. I think that those Doppel protests are incredibly important. And obviously it's something that gets forgotten because of the rush of all of just the endless travesties of Trump, including, by the way, pushing Doppel forward. Obama had actually frozen that project as a result of people's relentless and ferocious activism on that issue. And that actually basically teaches you everything, right? Which is that you never have a win without massive grassroots struggle, and the people in power, whether they're a Democrat or Republican, are not on your side. However, a Democratic administration might be susceptible to that pressure. A Republican one never will be, because the incentive and infrastructure is totally different. And therefore that struggle and that win completely went out the window when Trump assumed the presidency.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that really assumed that win was safe.
Right.
And then like a lot of Democrat skeptical people were really trusting Obama's pen to have been their savior there. And so they can move on to more important things.
Right. Which is utterly delusional. All right, guys, we're going to do a little pitch and then we're going to go read briefly this Lula's letter that was released to the Brazilian people, and then we'll go to Doug Lain. But first, we're going to talk about why it is time to become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show. One, is that music's very low. Oh, it's coming on? I'm definitely on a Dre kick. Everybody should watch that Defiance Ones documentary. It's really fascinating. Criticism, it does essentially turn into an ad for Apple Music, but it's a fascinating four-part documentary on really interesting people and basically like the creation of modern pop music.
Does he have stuff on the new Eminem album that I probably won't be able to bring myself to listen to?
I have no idea. I'm not anti Eminem, but I just don't.
I just can't.
I never was on board.
I was first couple albums. I was a big Eminem guy.
I could see that. I think when Eminem was first hitting, I was like, I mean, I always like listened to Nas, but I think that I was like trying to like not be so into pop culture. I was probably in a real like Bob Marley, Bob Dylan, fight the man phase.
You're saying Eminem was pop culture?
I'm sorry. I know that's really... I have enjoyed the Joe Budden Eminem beef, which maybe we'll get into at some point. I know that our friend, our comrade Jade Hoy over at Count the Dings, very emotional about Eminem.
And he's a big Eminem
guy. Oh yeah. The bearded evil genius is as serious about Eminem as he is about like, you know, the Tower or whatever, or the JFK assassination. My man loves Eminem. We continue to grow significantly here on the Michael Brooks Show. We reached 2,000 patrons, which are not that far from. We solidify what we're already doing. We have a few new offerings that we will be putting out, but mainly, as I say, we're just going to sort of keep the ship really in tight shape here with all the work that we're already doing, so we can continue to sort of be sustainable. At 2,000 patrons, we're going to do still the Glenn Beck fucking food bucket challenge with the genius Ronald Reagan.
My Patriot Supply.
My money is still on Matt to win this contest. But although I will not rule out the holistic equivalent of doping, I will be actually trying to participate in this. It's not like I'm not going to just like take a bite and be like, all right, I'm out. I'm going to try before the inevitable happens.
Well, somebody has to win something, though.
Okay, well, let's think about it. Let's think about that. That's actually a good point. We'll have, I mean, we could always just do like, because we're probably going to definitely need to go out and get drunk after it. We could just do like whoever's buying rounds, right?
That's a good idea.
That would be the simplest thing. All right, that's how we'll break it down. Rounds on the loser, 2-1. 2 rounds on the loser, 1 round on the runner-up. Winner drinks for free all night. Okay. And there's also a second compilation video of my impressions, which are going to be released when we hit 2,000 patrons. There is a whole political education now at this point, a little over a year of this show. Silicon Valley fascism, deep history of understanding South Africa, the transition to democracy. All of this history and context is actually quite important in and of itself, but always seems to actually track with anticipating, fighting, and defeating the memes of the neoliberals, the memes of the alt-right. The reality is that in order to do content like this, we need you to fund it. This show isn't doing advertising. I won't rule it out if it's actually like a sort of like advertiser that like we might know personally. And there's nothing like this in the pipeline. But I'm saying like the only way we'd have advertising would be like if we knew somebody who owned a small distillery or something and they wanted to sponsor it themselves. We're not doing, general. You won't be hearing me do a Casper mattress ad on this show. This is from you. You fund it. This is how this happens. And this is how we stay fully, completely independent and give you the type of analysis that we give you, the type of entertainment we give you, so that we can be really rigorous, but also reckless. So you can be sophisticated and have a lot of fun as well. The post games are a whole other experience. It's a strong community. There's, of course, the Discord community, which is going 24/7. It's definitely time to become a patron. Patreon.com/TMBS. Can you throw up, Matt, a link also to our YouTube channel? I just want people to know, if you haven't yet, we cracked our first 7,000 subscribers on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, and soon the live Michael Brooks Show will be streaming there as well. These clips deal obviously with the political issues of the day, but a lot to do with global issues, a lot to do with tracking the intellectual dark web, the comedy bits we do, the impressions, everything else. It's a great way of seeding the content and spreading the word on this show. We are so honored with all of the support we've had so far. This has been just objectively an incredibly successful first year of this show. And we're excited that the momentum is continuing. And we thank all of you. It's time to join. Subscribe to the Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Subscribe to the Michael Brooks Show on iTunes. Write a review. We're at 352 reviews there. And first and foremost, become a patron at patreon.com/TMBS. Get the full experience and camaraderie above regular phone calls with me. Next one this weekend. Thanks, everybody. Today in Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva officially ended his bid. He has been blocked every step of the way by what could only be fairly described as a judicial coup. That's my view. You're not going to dissuade me from that. He has requested that people vote for former São Paulo Mayor Fernando Haddad. This has all happened in the same week that the fascist candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, was stabbed at a rally. He lost 40% of his blood. He had a serious injury. He posed on Twitter recovering and did his gun hand symbol, which is he's known for flashing. And I have to say, it is easy to and correct to note the parallels between Bolsonaro and Trump, and it looks like the connections between him and Steve Bannon and this global fascistic moment, which no doubt the Republican Party and Donald Trump are a part of. But Bolsonaro's overt racism and calls for police killings really do parallel Duterte in the Philippines. That probably is the closest analog, according to people on the ground in Brazil. Lula led the polls by a significant margin in every single poll that was done. He was put into jail literally for what they called indeterminate acts. for a question over one condo. And I'm just going to read briefly from Lula's letter to the Brazilian people, and then we'll go to Doug Lain. I have never accepted injustice I have never accepted injustice or accepted. I have never accepted injustice or accepted it. For more than 40 years, I have been together with the people, defending equality and transforming Brazil into a better and more just country. And it was just walking through our country that I saw the suffering and burning close to the soul and hope shining again in the eyes of our people. I have seen the indignation at the very wrong things that are happening, the desire to prove life again. Specifically, again, the wrong things that are happening are that under Lula da Silva, between 30 and 50 million people were brought out of poverty. Programs like Bolsa Familia, which were direct cash transfers to people, cut out the middlemen and patronage systems. Significant rises in the minimum wage, enhanced labor rights, all made a massive material difference in the lives of Brazilian people. It's the reason that historian Perry Anderson called him the most successful politician in modern politics. Now under Michel Temer and this neoliberal Brazilian government, which would, of course, be continued by Bolsonaro, Wall Street is cozying up to him right now. Brazil has become a right-to-work country. Austerity has brought hunger back into that country as an issue, has reversed all of the social gains of the government. Just briefly from the rest of this letter. So I want to ask you from my heart, all those who would vote for me, to vote for Comrade Fernando Haddad for President of the Republic. I ask you to vote for our candidate for governor, deputy, and senator to build a more democratic, sovereign country without privatization of public resources, with more social justice, more education, more culture, education, culture, science, and technology, with more security, housing, and health, and with more employment, living wages, and agrarian reform. We are already millions of squid, and from now on, Fernando Haddad will be Lula to millions of Brazilians. See you soon, my friends. To victory. A hug from the old buddy, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. I love that guy. I know it's pretty obvious that I do, but I just don't understand how anybody couldn't love the guy. I do. I think all of these elections, I think it matters who you vote for here. Look up, it's significant that Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna and Barbara Lee and Keith Ellison and others have registered that solidarity. It matters here. And also, Brazil is the hegemon for Latin America. So that election will have significant ramifications for the security and social investment policies of an already very sort of the reverse tide and sort of reassertion of rightward politics across Latin America the last couple of years. We're going to take a brief break, and we will be right back with Doug Lain of Zero Books. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Douglas Lain. He's the publisher of Zero Books. He's the host of the Zero Books podcast. Check it out. Become a patron of it today. He's also my editor as I write this book that I'm working on for Zero Books. We are in hot pursuit of the ultimate antidote to the jerk encirclement or the intellectual dark web and really the global right as a whole. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. My goal is for you to write a book that makes Jordan Peterson tweet at like a bot version of you on Twitter. That's my ambition.
We need to set up a bot specifically so that happens, actually.
Yeah, that would be awesome. But yeah, I'm glad to be on your show today. And to be on 9/11 is sort of an odd thing to do. It's a big responsibility in a way.
It is a big responsibility. If I could just indulge me for one more comment.
Yes.
I want the book that I do for you at Zero Books to be intellectual apple cider.
Well, that's cruel. It's going to make him stay awake for a month and with feelings of doom.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's what he deserves. So
we have a new bit that we're road testing for the post game, where it's you take Jordan Peterson comments, but you do it in a stereotypical cheerleader voice. So it would be like Joe Rogan's like, "What? Like you couldn't sleep for a month because of apple cider?" And it's like, yeah. Think about like laying in bed in terror for like 8 hours. Like seriously. Yeah, it's like laying in bed for 8 hours. It's like Marxism.
That would work, and I really think that he would be just as successful if he had that persona.
I think there's no doubt. I think that we live in a very damaged time.
That's right.
And speaking of that damaged time, so as you know, the title of tonight's and this week's episode, and what we're talking about, is core simple Marxist concepts which can own capitalists at any time. It's a life hack for communism.
Right.
And we're talking about overdetermination, and we're talking about dialectics, and we're going to use these three examples of sort of the three main catastrophes that have sort of shaped life, at least in the United States, but to no insignificant effect the globe, obviously, because of the massive disproportionately effect that we have on the world, being the sort of, seat of capital and empire. Right. And that is September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks of that day, the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then the global financial meltdown emanating out of Wall Street in 2008. Can you tell us your relationship to those three events and how they cumulatively brought you to Marx? And you can start bringing us the sort of guide to our Marxist concepts that way.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that there's an alternate timeline we could consider, but I'll stick with yours. But I just want to say that we might consider 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq as one thing, and then the 2008 recession as the next thing, and now the election of Trump as the third event.
I'm actually cool with that. Take that timeline. That works. Yeah, because you could also include Afghanistan in there too, which does get ignored, but that's also caused an enormous amount of problems and human suffering as well.
Because I tend to think of it as, you have the international kind of foreign policy crisis and security crisis. You have the economic crisis, which from my way of thinking is maybe the most substantial crisis. And then you have a political crisis domestically, or really internationally too. But you have like a political crisis, or a crisis of the political class. And the easy thing to say is that these are all manifestations of the crisis of the contradictions within capitalist society. I mean, it's not that easy to say, maybe, but it's not that difficult to say either. But just how that worked out, or why we experienced these ruptures in the order in which we did, is maybe trickier to work out than most of us think. Or if you judge by our behavior, we treat these events as if there is no through line at all, as if you can treat each thing separately. And I'm struggling, actually, as I prepared to talk to you, I was struggling to kind of think up how to trace a line through all three events. And the easiest way would be to think of it from a left perspective, to think of it as events where there were missed opportunities for, I'll just say, revolutionary struggle, maybe not a full-on revolution, but at each point there was a failure of the left to take some sort of power. I mean, right after the Seattle protests, the WTO protests, we had September 11th, which shut down what had been a growing movement for radical change.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Because that's something that kind of it's interesting, because I think it hits people in a very specific age group. So for me, being in my mid-30s, that was actually a really big deal, because when I saw the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999 as a teenager, that was the first moment, because I was fascinated by politics, and I read The Nation and Counterpunch, and I understood that there was Noam Chomsky, and Clinton and Gore were actually just these horrible corporate bagmen, and there was various abuses in Latin America and of Native Americans and so on, and welfare reform was this attack on poor people, right? Like it existed, but in the mass culture, I mean, all you got was, it was actually an interesting time for music and pop culture in some ways, and certainly I think there was things going on with grunge and rap and everything, but it was just like, the tech bubble is great. All of a sudden there's dial-up. Everybody supposedly is making money on Wall Street. Bill Clinton is kind of this, he's this charming big dog rogue who just knows how to run the economy, and everybody can sort of like, things are so easy that we can get involved in his domestic drama because there's like nothing to worry about, right? Like we have time to contemplate all of these tawdry, depressing things about, this guy's sex life. Just because there's just nothing.
The Lewinsky scandal.
Yeah, everything is fine. And then all of a sudden this protest happens, and and superficially in the way people tried to frame it is like, oh, this is just these technical global trade regimes and these dumb hippies and intransigent labor guys don't understand it. This is the future. This is how we move forward. This is like the, teleology of capitalism. And this is when I first, God, Jesus Christ, I first heard of and had to read Thomas Friedman. But the most important bottom line was that actually, no, these global trade agreements, which are actually dictating the global architecture of the 1990s, are written in favor of global corporations. They privilege pharmaceutical companies over AIDS victims in Africa, as an example. They privilege arms manufacturers over those, seeking development and peace. And those protesting might not know all the details and all the technicalities, which is a common theme that keeps occurring again and again, but they're right on all of the fundamental merits. And there actually was a little bit of momentum there for a couple of years.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because in one way, and probably only one way, the 90s were similar to today in that we were experiencing kind of an artificial boom economically, and one which, got a lot of media attention and was celebrated, but which was unevenly distributed. The young people, especially back then, were also struggling to find work that would lead into anything other than, more work just like it. In other words, real careers were in short supply. And so I think that over the 90s, there was a lot of resentment built up amongst a certain population, young people, as well as just the usual inequality that breeds resentment and frustration amongst the downtrodden and underclass, and the ethnic minorities and the rest. And so, by 1999, the international situation was a great way to, the WTO and the trade agreements was a way to express a more general frustration with society. I mean, it was not unlike in its way the free speech movement of like 1964, 1963, where you had people expressing a general discontent with society and with what their future might hold for them, a rejection of kind of bourgeois society overall, but it manifested in opposition to, at first, university regulations around speech at Berkeley, and then also just against the war of Vietnam. So you had something similar going on in the late 90s, and it was more directly about capitalism than even the 60s movements had been, and or at least in the popular imagination. So I mean, one of the reasons there were some conspiracy theories on the left was because 9/11 did shut down or seemed to have such a dramatic impact on the prospects for a left movement. And so some people were, kind of crazily suggesting that, that was part of the plan, man. Right. But I don't believe that at all. But I do think that we were not prepared. The left was not prepared for the crisis. We weren't really. We were kind of a few steps behind the reality of our political situation and then the material situation. And the same thing is certainly true in 2008. I think that took everyone by surprise. I remember Howard Zinn talking on, I think it was like Democracy Now!, about how the economic crisis wasn't really substantial, and that the bank bailout just showed that if they had wanted to, they could have spent all that money on social on the welfare state all along, and it just showed their real priority is that they were spending money on the banks. But the reality was there actually truly was an economic major recession, and the banks were truly in crisis. And if there hadn't been the TARP program, the consequences socially would have been even worse.
Right. I mean, people would not have been able to get money out of ATMs.
Right.
I mean, the
and
debate.
Small businesses wouldn't have been able to pay their employees, and lots more businesses would have gone bankrupt because there were all these short-term loans that they rely on to keep going that they couldn't get.
Right. Okay, so I mean, I feel like so if we look from the late 90s to 2001, and I think, to be fair, I mean, after the September 11th attacks, there was this massive spasm of both real and organic fear, but also a fear that was exploited by and this has nothing to do with, I mean, of course, I don't buy September 11th conspiracy theories, but there's no doubt that the Bush administration and the, let's just use the shorthand, the neoconservative foreign policy, apparatus used that event to instigate everything from an invasion of Afghanistan, which maybe was a bit more complicated, but also, again, the same sort of deal in terms of mass civilian casualties. Literally, I mean, we're still there, right? And in fact, the Taliban will probably, I mean, there's no scenario where the Taliban won't have some significant power in Afghanistan. Then the invasion of Iraq, and then a torture regime, a scaling back of civil liberties. I mean, really, the whole architecture of the security apparatus that now, I mean, I was talking about in the beginning, that Jesus Christ, Donald Trump presides over, as terrifying as that is, and as insane as that is, was built out of that time. And there just wasn't an organic left at that point, I think, to meet that moment. There was this sort of burgeoning movement which was speaking against capital in various inchoate ways, but it wasn't, I mean, Barbara Lee was the only member of Congress, period, House or Senate. She voted against the authorization of military force right after September 11th. And of course, for that brave and foresighted decision, was a villain of Fox News and received endless death threats and, and
right.
plenty of, pretty solidly good Democrats, Paul Wellstone, Russ Feingold, Bernie Sanders, Dennis Kucinich, they all voted for the initial authorization, right? So that's where we were. In 2008, what's that about? Because that even seems even more specifically when the economic analysis and the kind of thread that could have come back to the late 90s could have come into play. And maybe now you can start explaining our dialectics and over-determination to situate ourselves here.
Okay, I'll try to. My cat is just jumping on my computer and distracting me here. I don't want it to turn off the computer.
That is an incredibly, it is the most college professor thing that has ever been said on this show. You're not even a college professor, Doug.
Door, okay? Because if it turns it off, it'd be worse than interrupting. So 1 second.
Okay. Wow, Doug in a live action play here, moving his cat out of the room. Doug Lain, you can hear him puttering around, no doubt, a book-lined study.
Sorry, Michael. She doesn't respond until I start talking, and then she starts climbing all over the furniture here. So okay,
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
I was actually just doing a play-by-play of what your room is probably like.
Yeah,
so it's fine. It's good content.
I need to clean my room.
Yes, you do. You need to clean your goddamn room. All right, go ahead.
2008. I can just tell you my personal reaction to it, which was that to me, it was as terrifying in its way as 9/11, if not more so, because I saw society. I mean, I kind of saw the two things as connected. After 9/11, I thought, well, society is obviously not on secure ground, and then 2008, the kind of the understructure started to crumble as well. It wasn't just on the surface, but it was this deep rot in our society, it seemed like. But I didn't really understand what the basis of the crisis was.
Right.
I mean, I knew that the banks were in trouble and that there was cheating, but I didn't understand the full dynamic of it. And I still probably don't understand all the full dynamic of it, but I have a better general picture because I started to, at that time, reach out to leftists and economists to ask them what the hell's going on, and started to explore Marx. At that point, I was more of a kind of an anarchist liberal type before the economic crisis. So what I would say is that if to try to draw a connection between 9/11 and 2008 is difficult, except in so much as we had been in kind of a stagnant decline for 30 years before September 11th, and that the kind of imperialist projects that were going on in that time were somewhat a reaction to our own internal problems economically and socially. Mm-hmm. So, the simple-minded way to put it is we were going overseas to find new markets and to find cheaper labor and all of that kind of thing. But that was not going to be a final solution to the declining rate of profit, which was driving crisis, and that it broke through in 2008 and then got papered over again is kind of what happened there. But politically, it's an interesting moment, too, because, George Bush was, for the left, the worst president there had ever been at that, in 2007, 2008.
Right.
Whatever popularity he might have had on the left, in certain segments of the left, right after 9/11 had completely evaporated. The invasion of Iraq was considered a complete disaster, and then you add on the economic crisis, and
Katrina. Katrina's there as well. Yeah,
Katrina was huge. Yeah,
right.
So you have probably the least popular president in recent history, modern history, residing and being taken down, or the Republican Party being taken out by this young black presidential candidate. And it was a moment of great hope. And I think a lot of people thought in 2008 that Barack Obama would be Bernie Sanders, that he would be this kind of New Deal, Great Society Democrat who would introduce a lot of social spending in order to help people during the crisis, and that we'd get back to what are a lot of people's vision of what socialism was, or what it is, through the Obama administration. But that didn't happen, of course.
And then the stagnation of that, and the sort of ongoing realities of that, with, of course, all of the resurgence of the xenophobia and racism and fear-mongering of American society, which is fed just by literally having an African-American guy in office, helps set the stage for Trump. But what I want to make sure, and I think what's funny about Obama is I think it's funny in both, and people are going to tag me as an Obama apologist, which I'm really not. But what strikes me is, like, you weren't, in some ways, Obama's stimulus should get a little bit more credit than it does for doing some of that sort of stopping the bleeding through Keynesian spending, right? Mm-hmm. Some. And then conversely, if you thought he was Bernie Sanders in 2008, you weren't listening to him, and you weren't looking at where his campaign contributions were coming from. Like, right. This guy was not that. He's obviously, he's a very intelligent person, so he gave some very thoughtful critiques of Wall Street. But his economic team, especially during the transition, when it kind of like he stopped talking with, the Joseph Stiglitz and Robert Reich types, and, the Lawrence Summers and the Tim Geithners were fully in control, it was obvious what that administration was going to be. And it was not going to even be, it was not even going to be a really Keynesian one at all.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and okay, so yeah, you're absolutely right. And I wasn't one of the people who thought Obama was going to be the next FDR, but I do think that's where the kind of the left vision of the Obama presidency was, somewhere around there. That's what people tried to tell themselves might happen, and that's why, for specifically leftists, there was so much hope invested in Obama. But one of the things that you mentioned it a couple times, and I've been ducking it because it's complicated. One of the things that has stayed with me over the years, and that's kind of becoming more and more obvious as the Trump administration pushes on, is that while we can kind of catalog these moments and see the crisis come up in these particular instances, we often can't explain them fully. I don't think I can explain, for instance, why it was necessary or deemed necessary to invade Iraq.
Right.
It was such an irrational thing to do, really. There was no even plausible justification for it, even at the time. Certainly in retrospect, there's none. But even at the time, it was clearly kind of the actions of a rogue state.
Right.
So, you had to go against the UN. It wasn't like in 1991 with the original Desert Storm, where there was a consensus in the UN, and it could be justified on the grounds of getting rid of a foreign invader in Kuwait. No. This was sort of out of nowhere, an invasion of a sovereign nation on the basis of preemptive self-protection and or human rights, or protecting from terrorism, even though the terrorists that were really on the radar at that point were not in Iraq and no connection to Iraq. So there's a kind of irrationality at work in history, at least recent history. Like Trump is another example where we think we can kind of explain why that happened, but the timing doesn't match up. I mean, and the economic explanations for it would be that a lot of resentment is built up in the working class, and they're turning to an authoritarian figure after liberal solutions have failed. But we're actually relatively in an economic boom right now.
And actually most of his voters are very well off economically, contrary to the myth of this working class backlash. His base is actually relatively affluent and suburban. But you're getting us to overdetermination.
I'm getting to overdetermination.
One of our key concepts from Marx for owning capitalists. Explain overdetermination.
Well, I'm not sure. I feel like that might be false billing. But overdetermination is this, comes from
fucking marketing, for God's sake. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, you can own all the capitalists with overdetermination.
Yes, Jesus. And also dialectics. That's the other one we're hitting.
And actually, it's really mostly a concept for Marxists and people on the left to try to figure out how to go about in a struggle for socialism, more than it is a way to refute some libertarian nut job. So the idea with overdetermination is that you have to basically understand that a materialist analysis of politics can't stop at the level of a material analysis, that superstructural or ideological factors can take the driver's seat at times. Like, for instance, with the invasion of Iraq, you had said earlier today, before we got on the line here, that it could just be that we were kind of swept up in a war hysteria, and that there was a general feeling that we needed to prove ourselves on the world stage after the humiliation of 9/11. And
one of the things that's most revealing, just as a brief button to this, Tony Blair is reported to have said, if it was just about oil, we could have made oil deals with Saddam, which is fascinating and revealing in a number of ways. This is revealing because that statement actually totally undermines the assertion that Saddam was a security threat in this unique, terrifying way. Because if you could just make an oil deal with him, then you could just presumably negotiate any number of things with him. And obviously, nobody in the top apparatus of the Bush or Blair teams were, seriously concerned about human abuses, right? We already know that even just from other regimes that they supported at the time, like in Kazakhstan, that were literally boiling people alive. But it did seem that at the time, there wouldn't be an interest in the Middle East and Iraq if there wasn't vital natural resources at stake. But there was this very extreme ideology that had been fostering in extremist think tanks in the 90s, and people like Dick Cheney and and Armitage and Richard and Wolf, and Wolfowitz, they got an opportunity to play their ideology out, and they did.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that's a good explanation in a sense. I mean, of course, if you press Blair with that point, what he would say was, no. What I'm saying is that we went to Iraq on a humanitarian mission to help the Iraqi people.
Right.
But there was always this move. If one thing falls down, then you can move back to one of the other explanations that have already been discredited. So, no, it wasn't. It was about terrorism and, getting rid of those weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. Oh, wait, they didn't exist? Well, then, we had interests in the region or,
right.
oil interests. But, yeah, no one can quite land on the proper explanation. And I think the reason why is because we are looking always in only one realm at a time. Like if we try to ask why did we invade Iraq, we look at the kinds of political players that were there and the politics behind that decision, or we look behind the economics and the oil interests and things like that, the corporate interests in the region, or we look at ideological reasons. But these things all come together to create these moments. And I think that we also probably somebody smarter than I needs to look back and take a really close look at the larger economic factors. What was going on around that time that might have, or maybe years earlier, that had set up conditions for this kind of reaction to take hold in the United States. How had economic insecurity, for instance, in 2001, played a role in the decisions to have this war on terror that lasted forever and justified any invasion we wanted. But for me, when I think about these questions, what I'm most interested in figuring out is how can we get a better understanding in order to push forward a struggle for socialism. We can't just accept answers that sound good. We have to. These historical moments actually are important and need to be, thought through again and again, I think.
In the last couple of minutes, can you give us so overdetermination is this important way, I think, of basically having some type of integral or holistic, if I could just inject those words in, of saying like, if you're dealing with complex situations, you've got to take all the complexity in. And obviously it can become a cop-out to just say like, well, it's everything, man. But on the other hand, it actually sort of is. Right. And you need to disaggregate and take in all of those variables if you really want to have a proper analysis of the situation. Can you also give us a little bit of how we could use what dialectics, it's another one of these words that gets thrown around a lot, and how it might be relevant? What I've always appreciated from David Harvey is just the idea that dialectics is a way of understanding history as dynamic relationships between things instead of linear causality and progression, that things are actually interacting and building on each other and creating dynamic situations in a non-linear way.
Right. Well, Hegelian dialectics is interesting because it says that any particular concept doesn't ever have can't be substantiated on its own.
Right.
So like if you want to understand a law, for instance, you have to take into account what the violation of the law is at the same time. That that opposites are reinforcing each other. Like being and non-being are in dialectic relationship with each other, or the subject.
David and Matt are in dialectic relationship with each other.
Well, possibly, yeah.
Stare, one drunk, one stoned at their computer
non-being.
monitors. Yeah.
But okay, so if you take that into kind of a materialist analysis, then the dialectic is between it becomes a class struggle between the people who own capital and the people who are exploited.
Right.
And on one side of that equation is the force that will be able to overcome the contradiction that at the moment sustains the relationship. So it's the working class that will be able to overturn the capitalist relationship according to Marx, because, well, I'm not sure if it's a dialectical reason or not, but it's primarily because as the exploited class, they and the class that does the actual material work, they are the class that benefits the least from the relationship and also has the real physical power to transform the world. So they're in a good position to change that relationship. So that's sort of my understanding of dialectics in a nutshell. But then when you get to the level of economics and culture in a dialectical relationship, to be honest, I think that that's an open question. I mean, I don't think that there have been lots of ways that socialists have tried to work out that relationship, but what you've got instead of a consensus there is maybe another dialectical struggle between tendencies on the left. And it's worthwhile to kind of examine those struggles. And frankly, preparing to talk to you today made me realize I want to do a lot more work on this question and more reading and maybe make videos and things, because that's where, and it's been something I've been talking about on the podcast with C. Derek Varn and others, the relationship between base and superstructure. But somehow preparing to talk to you today made me realize that the concept of overdetermination and seeing how these things played out historically might be the best way to develop my understanding of a theory as well. This is where you become historical in the way you theorize, maybe.
I think it's a great place to leave us. And I just think, though, that one of the things that these concepts do help us with, and they actually are helpful for the owning capitalist tagline, and in this sense I'm being less tongue-in-cheek, which is that instead of for like this, that was actually something, that was a big discourse that came out of 2008, was it, on some level we all know actually that yes, especially relative to the situation, Wall Street deregulation absolutely did allow for the orgy of speculation and self-dealing and betting against your own investments and housing fraudulent policies by the banks, like all of these just despicable Wall Street practices that like good reporters like Matt Taibbi and others and David Dane have reported on, right? Like we know and can confidently make the argument that the crisis came from Wall Street. And then the right had to look for, oh, no. What it really was actually policies to try to get poor people to own homes and, all of this stuff. And but I think that what these tools allow us to do, though, is to not get caught in those narrow, pedantic debates. Because the reality is like, if you're actually taking an overdetermined and a dialectic but materialist perspective that really has an actual understanding of how capital operates, even if you hit a gotcha, like for the wrong reasons, right? So like those attacks on initiatives to support poor ownership of homes by working class people are, totally racialized and disingenuous, and they reverse engineer the problem. It's like, okay, it's not Wall Street pushing for policies for a new area of speculation. It's really the incredible lobbying power of poor families in Washington. Like, we know that's a ridiculous, disingenuous argument. But that being said, even if they were able to say, hey, this actually is a policy mechanism here that contributed to the crisis, and maybe they scored some relative small point. If we're not just fighting on the narrow margins of what was the particular specific causal relationship of this or that regulation, but we're actually talking about the real structure of how Wall Street actually operates on the economy as a whole, then those kind of gotcha small games don't work nearly as well, because we're really talking about how the whole goddamn engine operates.
Yeah, and can I say something about that specific example? Because it's a really good one. So like, if you think that the financial crisis the economic crisis came from finance, that it was a banking problem, then your solution to that is going to be constrained. Mm-hmm. And you're going to try to use regulations to solve the problem. Also, though, you are, as you say, more open to the attack from the right, who might be able to point out some very real policies that created a situation where there were incentives to give loans to people who really couldn't afford them.
Right.
Now, the truth of that was it wasn't those policies that were primarily responsible for that, but the weakness of the banks and the incredible amount of speculation and corrupt practices that swept through the financial sector that made a lot of those loans happen. It wasn't just, some liberal senator who was a bleeding heart, who made that happen.
Right, of course.
But then, but the other thing is, like, why were the banks in such a weak state to begin with? Why was it that it was so difficult for so many people to afford to buy a home? What was going on in the housing market that created this inflated value of mortgages? Why did the property prices go up so high? And
why do we have a rentier class that
Right.
that transfers wealth through inheritance, and property is totally concentrated along class and racial line? What were the origin policies of how we make capital work in this country?
Right. And as you dig on those questions, which aren't always immediately obvious, you can come up with a analysis where you can see a problem which is inherent to our social system as it is. I mean, it's basically inherent to capitalism. And that's what happened. That's what I did over several years with a podcast, by interviewing a lot of economists and talking about it and reading Marx and so on. I, came to believe in the theory of the declining rate of profit and Marx's theory of exploitation and labor theory of value, all of which helped me get a better handle on at least that particular incident, the recession of 2008, which, by the way, at the time and for several years later, I thought would be all I ever needed in terms of my radical politics. Like, I could explain that, and that would lead to revolution. People understood that the source of the economic crisis was, especially just right around the time of Occupy Wall Street. I thought that's what we need. Then we can take the power and we can form new kinds of forms of production, take over the factories and create utopia. But now I'm realizing that, the system's ability to paper over crisis and to transform it into something else, like a political crisis instead, is pretty profound, and that, you can't stop at one level of analysis, and that there's a reason why Marxists in history have delved into cultural analysis along with the economics that Marx gave us in the Capital. And I think that, but you have to have both, and I think that it's a very good idea to understand Marx's primary theories from Capital's volumes 1, 2, and 3, and then bring in more analysis from other realms and try to figure out the way an economic crisis can influence the culture or the political situation.
We're coming with the apple cider. We're coming with the apple cider. You can hear it.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson.
Oh, boy. Oh, that apple cider is coming, bro. This is all going to be in the book. Imagine a book that counteracts Sam Harris on any number of levels, but including with an idea of a fully globalized enlightenment, borrowing from ideas from Amartya Sen, and also has an actual accounting of Marxism. I think that there might be years before Jordan Peterson gets any sleep. And Sam Harris is going to get so taken out of context, his head's going to spin.
Yeah.
I'm sure that will be clipped by literalist idiots out there. Doug Lain, publisher of Zero Books, host of the Zero Books podcast. Please check him out. It's a brilliant show, brilliant work. Also, Doug, you have 2 short story collections that you wanted to talk about with regards.
I just want to mention them because they're relevant. I collected short stories around 9/11 a few years back. In 2015, it came out, which were short stories that were written by science fiction and fantasy writers in response to the attacks of 9/11. And it was my way of trying to reimagine what the impact of that had been culturally and politically, and get other people's work to become part of my own work. So by rearranging it and curating it, I made my own message out of other people's stories. And the same thing is true with the second collection, which was called Deserts of Fire, which looked at just the modern war or modern warfare from the U.S.-centric perspective, and has some really great short stories in that collection as well, starting with short stories written in response to the Vietnam War and ending with stories written in response to 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq.
Douglas Lain, thanks a million as always. Talk to you soon, brother.
All right, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye. All right, folks, we are going to continue with... We still haven't changed it, huh? We're still on the gulag. Do you guys feel elevated after Douglas Lain?
I was feeling elevated already, but definitely.
You're unusually elevated tonight, like borderline insubordinate. Play the gulag music, please, which we are still not... I don't know if we're ever going to change the name of this segment, to be honest with you.
Well, I think this one is a very deserving.
No, this one is, in any just world, this guy absolutely ends up in a gulag. This isn't just some nuisance on social media. This is
enemy of the people.
This is this is an enemy of the people globally. This is a truly hideous, despicable subhuman. John Bolton, who of course was the Bush administration's ambassador to the United Nations, a fierce advocate of war globally, an enemy of the humanitarian needs of all people, but particularly the Palestinians. We're going to open with this clip from Al Jazeera outlining what John Bolton has done with regards to essentially just getting revenge with the Trump administration. This goes along with cutting funding for Palestinian refugees and hospitals, and recent moves that are purely designed to just be in concert, of course, with the Israeli far right that runs Israel, and just moves to just be capricious and cruel to the already, of course, highly suffering and oppressed Palestinian people. This is a report from Al Jazeera on John Bolton, the International Criminal Court, and the Palestinians.
Protests in the West Bank. As news filtered out, Washington was making good on its threat. National Security Advisor John Bolton made it official. The U.S. is closing the Washington office of the Palestine Liberation Organization, an effort to put pressure on Palestinians to return to the negotiating table amid stalled peace talks with Israel.
The Trump administration will not keep the office open when the Palestinians refuse to take steps to start direct and meaningful negotiations with Israel.
The threat of the mission's closure, seen by many as retaliation for actions by the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas last year at the United Nations, calling for the investigation and prosecution of Israeli officials through the International Criminal Court. The actions enraged many in the United States, who see the ICC as a body rife with abuses and an infringement on U.S. sovereignty. On Monday, Bolton called for criminal sanctions against the ICC if it moves ahead with investigating allegations of U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. Those sanctions could even include blocking ICC judges from entering the United States.
The United States will use any means necessary to protect our citizens and those of our allies from unjust prosecution by this illegitimate court.
John Bolton, of course, has always been an enemy of any type of international accountability. As I said, he was a staunch proponent of the invasion of Iraq. He's spoken in favor of military interventions in Iran and North Korea. And has always been an opponent, of course, of any type of accountability for U.S. abuses, which, of course, are rampant in Afghanistan and elsewhere. What else are the Palestinians to do? They have an Israeli government that continues to build and expand settlements. The West Bank is an open-air prison. We see on a regular basis that civilians protesting are murdered in Gaza by Israeli security forces, and there's absolutely nothing to indicate that the Israeli government or its prime patron will ever make even the most basic move to conform with the most basic outlines of any two-state solution or their obligations according to international law or even the State Department until that changes under Trump. They are appealing in international bodies symbolically to keep their struggle alive because that's the only venue they have, and this administration will punish them for it. And that's why we sentence, and this really is an aspirational sentence, John Bolton to the Gulag. Matt, first of all, you need to get yourself a bong water sound effect. Do you know what you're doing for your segment?
I do, yes.
Is this a different one? Is this chopped and screwed, or did you get another one?
This is just, this is SoundCloud by BK. It looks like he himself, some guy that chopped this up, is smoking a joint on his album art. So thanks to him for this.
Hey, baby, put down that pipe and get my pipe up.
Think of that in the weed sense, Matt. All right. Matt Leck regulates. He gives us lessons on how to hold the scumbags of the world accountable on Twitter. This is actually another version of key concepts for owning fascists in this case.
Yeah, this is Boris Epstein, the Sinclair media clown.
He really is. He's the most lazy man in the history of broadcasting.
Yeah, he's very incompetent. He's also like 34, and he's in his.
That guy is in his 30s.
He's born in '84. Yeah, man. Wow. He's a 80s kid.
That's fucking amazing.
Being evil really ages you.
So he tweeted out this thing. Think about it. The Nike and Kaepernick ad isn't about promoting any sort of political or social agenda. It is about generating controversy and capitalizing on the great divide in the country. And I think that's partially true, and I think we're all, skeptical of corporations. One of the main perversities about America is how you mainly only feel empowered as a consumer.
Right.
And Nike is a terrible corporation. Their labor standards are appalling. They appall us, monthly, it seems like. But it also reminds me of something that just papering over that is a problem because, for instance, Nike isn't just going to put Richard Spencer as a spokesperson because that's going to turn off their consumer base, basically. 2 in 3
people that wear Nike shoes are under 35 years of age, and it's a radically diverse consumer base. And we're going to talk about this more in the post game, but this is a very smart play for the market future of Nike.
And it reminds me of this thing that I always see with fans of a certain show that we hit on, Jimmy Dore show, where they seem to think they're to the left of us because they think Democrats and Republicans are the same. And my problem with that is, I've read Engels' The Conditions of the Working Class in the 1830s, and he talks about specific industries, right? It's not just, I think it's a red flag when people do that Democrat-Republican thing because it means that their version of class politics is establishment, whatever that means, versus everybody else.
And that is historically, and I'm really, just to be clear, I'm not talking specifically about anybody here, but that's also historically how smart, vital left and Marxist analysis devolves into conspiracy theories, which actually would obviously apply to something like Jimmy Dore, but also things like anti-Semitism. Because you go into from the understanding of the function of capital to like the establishment or the cabals, and those cabals are usually often historically because of anti-Semitism Jewish, and you have just a moralistic comic book understanding of the world and not a materialist one.
Right. So, like, for instance, a real estate industry is going to be a different sort of operator than a shoe company is. And it reminded me of this old LBJ tape from an old project I had called Informationer on SoundCloud. And I'm just going to play the first minute and a half of this. But it's LBJ talking to George Smathers, who's a Florida senator. And Smathers is reporting back about how the grocery store sort of magnates that he knows are saying yeah, we can't have Goldwater in because people are going to have money to spend, right? As a grocery store owner, I want people in the community to have money to spend.
They like the Great Society programs that are gearing up the economy with a Keynesian boost so that normal people can go out and buy their groceries. And you would bed music underneath these historical clips was Informationer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just so people are ready.
Yeah, so here you'll see Smathers and LBJ, and this is a tape. And LBJ chose went to run these tapes.
And attacking China and a few things like that to go to war before. We're going to swing them back.
The main thing that ruined y'all is his economic policies. He's jerking in here and saving $5 to $10 billion, and he's pulling out of every foreign country, and he's telling them all to go to hell. And what you do, your export trade that we got a $6 billion surplus of, you'd be backed by God, grass would be going to the streets, and these guys wouldn't have this prosperity in these jobs.
Win Dixie, I just before talking to you, talking to son and J.E. Davis, who is probably the biggest, most successful businessman in the whole Southland. He owns this big chain of grocery stores, Win Dixie, Quick Check, and Colonial, and so on. The whole thing. Just this minute, got off the phone with him, and he was saying, he said, I tell you what, he said, I'll be damned if I can be for Goldwater. And he said, my whole program, and I do $1.7 billion worth of business a year. And he said it's based on the democratic type philosophy of economics. And he said, we may have a little bit of inflation. On a hell, I'd rather have a little bit of inflation than to go back to the days where everybody's pulling in, nobody's buying things. He said it would kill us. And he said,
So I see old Stets Coleman sent him.
All right, and then LBJ goes into like basic corruption stuff. It's pretty entertaining, but
nice.
Yeah, I just think it's instructive, and people need to be. That's the sort of. I think strategically that sort of thing is important. We need to be more precise about the type of capitalists there are.
This is something where actually being precise is actually important. Now loop this back to Epstein and Nike. Did you respond? Because did you respond to him?
Oh, well, yeah, I did. Well, I responded. There's a reason.
Show the response. Yeah.
Yeah, I just said that point about it, which is why Nike is also doing an ad with Richard Spencer. Because if it was all just about controversy and making money off tearing us apart, right?
Of course, Nike would if it paid. But if Boris thought about it, why it won't for a minute. He noticed something important about democratic power and consumer corporations. Because you didn't read the second. Yeah. You read why isn't Nike doing an ad with Richard Spencer? Which is, I guess, the second
sarcastic.
Point. Right. Okay. No, I think that's actually a really important point about understanding the divisions within the capital class itself in order to get a specific understanding about how all of these things play out. I mean, I've been seeing. I'm not really trying to get into all this Jimmy Dore stuff anymore. I think it's pretty obvious what's going on there. But this whole I mean, I work with fucking Tucker Carlson to end war. Tucker Carlson is not anti-war. And if you don't see the connection between a broad general xenophobia and the fact that that is directly contradictory of not only building the types of coalitions that you need for left politics here, but in fact internationally. Because you want to talk about building a global anti-war movement, you think that people are going to trust a prime xenophobe on that? I don't think so. It's fucking nonsense. We have to get to the Griscom Economic Minute. And please, solicitations for a very, 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 very stuffy and stodgy 1970s style PBS music.
Nice 10 seconds.
Nice 10 to 15 seconds.
I need it.
David Griscom, go ahead.
Okay, so
you little prick. Go ahead.
This week, I want to talk about the Trump meltdown over the economy and how he feels like he's not getting enough credit. He released a pretty hilarious.
He never gets enough credit.
He released
fucking press won't give him credit.
No, but the fake news, yeah. No, it's actually
was that like
I don't know
Hirohito Trump?
When we pull up the fact sheet that Trump released, I'll show you it a little bit. It's pretty funny because it's like half of the sheet is him literally just complaining about the fake news media and not at all about like the economic statistics.
Yeah, he's super mentally well.
So here they are right here. So he goes through some of the factors. And we'll get to it in a second, but just go to the bottom where it says deserving credit where credit is due. And just look how long it is. He just goes through all the pundits who he feels like didn't give him enough credit for the economic recovery. And it goes on for a very long time.
Oh my God. So this is literally like media commentators, economists, and Democratic officials have all sought to credit the Obama administration for President Trump's economic success. In August 2008, Larry Summers claimed the president is taking credit for more economic success than he deserves. Jerry Bernstein, former chief economist to Vice President Joe Biden, said there's not a shred of evidence President Trump is contributing to strong economic trends.
Can you believe the New York Times reporters wrote that most, if not all, of the positive indicators continue trends that began during the Obama administration? What the fuck are they saying that for?
It's like a dossier of and I love how what I love is how actually dry and anodyne these quotes are. They're not like President Trump is totally taking credit for President Obama's. They're all the trend line that began under President
That's
Obama.
just a clear statement of
yeah,
fact.
like these are literally just dry statements of fact from dry economists.
Christopher Rugaber from the Associated Press said the economy remains essentially the same sturdy one President Trump inherited from Barack Obama.
Total lie.
Asshole. Can we kill him?
Yeah. Is there any way we could drop a drone on him? Can JSOC kill him? Yeah, don't try to take that paper off my desk.
No, I mean it's definitely incredible, and it's very Trumpian, the whole response. But yeah, I just wanted to take us through it a little bit because everyone's very excited because Obama clapped back at Trump, something that he hasn't really done too much. So I just wanted to take a quick second and just talk about the crisis for a second structurally. So a lot of people understand the story now about the subprime mortgage crisis and what led to the financial crisis. But let's take it a little bit more Marxist, a little bit more structural. What caused this crisis in the first place? Well, the fact is that wage growth for the working class has been stagnant or even on the decline for the past 30, 40 years. Meanwhile, the wealthiest Americans sucked up the majority of the wealth in this country. So what do you do if you have a bunch of money? Well, it needs to go somewhere. Obviously, they are not very interested in redistributing their wealth. So a great place to put your money is just to loan it out to people who need money.
Right.
So large amounts of cash was basically put into the financial economy, and those were loaned out to continue consumer spending because we want working people to be able to buy houses. They had credit cards to encourage consumer spending, housing loans, which obviously becomes a big deal later.
Right.
But basically, a lot of the wealth of the wealthiest Americans starts to filter into this economy. Now, eventually, this starts to become very toxic because people are just trying to make a quick buck. But I think it's really important that we understand that, the credit economy is important. A lot of small businesses use the credit economy to buy inventory at the beginning of the month. Farmers obviously need that to be able to front the amount of money it takes in to have productive yields. So this isn't something that just is all wicked and bad. And when this started to crash, something really needed to be done. And there were some people who were very cynical on the left who were sort of hoping that the whole thing would crash and burn down. And you know what? I'm sorry, I just don't have the heart for that because if that system collapsed, we would be facing a very serious Great Depression where people the effects of this recession were bad enough, but what would have come if you didn't intervene would have been much worse.
Yeah, of course.
The problem with what Obama did wasn't that he intervened; it was the way that he intervened.
Right.
So let's just talk for a second. In the first 2 years of the recovery, 121% of the gains in income following the crash went to the top 1%. Meanwhile, the bottom 25% of workers actually saw their wages continue to decrease. So from the very beginning, the Obama recovery was already incredibly lopsided. And why was that? It was because the majority of the actions taken by Obama were just trying to stabilize and to reignite the creditors and the credit economy and to bolster asset prices. So most people lost a big chunk of change because their assets started to decline during the initial recession. So they were so fixated on sort of stabilizing the wealthiest people in this country that the majority of Americans, let's not forget, and this is not talked about enough, but 9.3 million families lost their homes to foreclosure during this crisis. And those people weren't people who were fixed. The people who were giving out these toxic loans were the ones who were helped out by the Obama administration. And actually, there's a really interesting report about Tim Geithner that just came out that he actually obstructed Obama ordered him to start coming up with a list of punishments that they could do to the people, the bankers. And he actually delayed that, sort of pigeonholed it until
he pretended he was going to pursue it to Obama and then slow walked it till it died.
Yeah, so
that undermined Obama's own actual correct instincts on that. Tim Geithner is absolutely one of the prime villains of the modern economy, and is right now actually involved in I believe it's predatory lending.
Oh, he 100% is involved in predatory
disgusting
lending. And all these characters from the major characters of the financial crisis are all back.
Yes.
But anyways, so the Obama recovery is basically that you have, recovery for the wealthiest Americans, while the majority of us still are incredibly, suffering. And the amount of wealth that was destroyed from the working class was something that was, historic. So what we've had since is we've had some small growth in GDP and a smaller unemployment number. right? But we haven't seen that translate into wage gains, which is something that's the most important thing. And when people talk about the economy like Trump, they're going to look at inflation, they're going to look at GDP growth, and they're going to look at unemployment numbers. But as we know, those don't always necessarily translate into better situations for the working class. So while Trump is, talking about this, the GDP growth, which by the way, he wasn't talking too much last quarter when GDP growth was only around 2%. Because of a big falling off in consumer spending, and now because it's up around 4.1% this quarter, Trump's going historic GDP growth. Meanwhile, a lot of people in the financial press are warning that they think that the next few cycles of GDP growth are going to be somewhere more around 1.5%.
Right.
And that's because Trump's doing wild stuff like this trade war with China and just general instability that is, it's making people...
General instability, good old GI, that's me.
Well, these people, they don't want to invest in their companies. They don't want to make any bets because you don't know what's going to happen 6 months from now. So, these Trump numbers are definitely blowing his own horn. When Trump is talking about the recovery, he's definitely is still talking about the Obama recovery because that's what has funded this economy was the era of cheap money, which expanded a lot of wealth for people on the top part of the country. But for the working people, there really has not been any kind of serious recovery. And just, as an aside, something that I think is just so cynical, Trump is always talking about black unemployment numbers. Mm-hmm. But those unemployment numbers are actually quite bleak if you look at major cities. In Washington, D.C., for example, which has a enormous black population, the unemployment numbers are somewhere, I'm remembering this from the top of my head, I think around 14.1%, which is massive.
Yeah.
So it's like one of these things we can't talk about the economy in these kind of very abstract pegs. We have to look at it as an entire system. And what's very clear is that working people still are getting a very bad deal. And Obama and Trump can have pissing contests about the recovery. And obviously Trump is just talking out of his ass. I mean, he was talking about how he was taking credit for the economy on his first day in office.
Right.
But at the same time, we need to be serious when we talk about these and analyze them, that there was a recovery for the wealthiest people in this country, fueled by the structural system that created the financial crisis in the first place. And there has not been a serious recovery for the working class, and it's not likely to happen under Donald Trump.
It's definitely not going to happen under Donald Trump. It might happen under Bernie Sanders 2020. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. Become a member of the Michael Brooks Show today. Become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. In this post game alone, we're talking about Trump, the travesty and just despicable record of Trump and Puerto Rico, which, of course, he's bragging about. We're going to get deeper into the dialectic of how we figure out Nike and Kaepernick. And, of course, we're revisiting Cidergate, as well as Dave Rubin's response to the Koch brothers' claims of the Koch brothers funding him. Your calls, your Discord questions, your IMs, all of that. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. Next week, crew Alona Minkowski joins us in studio. Catch up on all back episodes of Woke Bros. Waz and I remembered Mac Miller. He passed away. It's a very sad story. We talked about Mac Miller. We also broke down and debated Nike and Kaepernick, as well as Steve Bannon, his bloated self, and the mediocre New Yorker Ideas Festival this Sunday, an illicit history of the war on terrorism with Derek Davison. Next week, Joshua Kahn is back with the Activism series. Help us continue to thrive and grow. Subscribe to The Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Like The Michael Brooks Show on Facebook. Follow us all on Twitter. And, of course, become a patron at patreon.com/TMBS. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. We will see you all in the postgame.